During the Titanic disaster of 1912, men secured lifeboat seats for women and children, and those few men who survived the sinking were grilled in the U.S. Senate about why they weren't dead. The traditional notion that men owed women protection and women owed men gratitude was generally confirmed by the behavior of passengers and crew. The feminist response to the sinking, however, was to deny that women owed men anything and to express outrage that men had never yet done enough for them. I'm Janice Fiamengo, and this is the Fiamengo File 2.0. The allegedly unsinkable British steamship Titanic sank in the early hours of April 15th after striking an iceberg in the North Atlantic Ocean, only 5 days into its maiden voyage from Southampton, England to New York City. As we now know, the ship's bulkhead compartments were constructed in such a manner that water could pour from one bulkhead compartment into another. And this was exactly what happened after the iceberg caused a 300-foot breach in the Titanic's hull. The inadequate number of lifeboats and the fact that most lifeboats were launched only about half full during the haphazard evacuation meant that close to 2/3 of the Titanic's passengers, the vast majority of them men, died in the disaster. The last wireless message of the Titanic reported that the ship was, quote, sinking by the head, have cleared boats and filled them with women and children. Women and children first was the law of the sea, and many newspaper accounts emphasized the stories of individual men who helped others and accepted their own deaths stoically. Many of these stories, reported by survivors, are almost inconceivably poignant. Millionaire businessman Benjamin Guggenheim was one who died. Survivor Rose Ickard recorded in a letter how, after assisting with the lifeboats, he, quote, got dressed and put a rose at his buttonhole to die. He sent a message to his wife through his cabin steward, Henriette's, quote, tell my wife in New York that I've done my best in doing my duty. Business magnate Colonel John Jacob Astor, the richest person on the ship and considered one of the richest men in the world, was last seen on the ship's deck smoking a cigarette with American mystery writer Jacques Futrelle. Astor had just helped his wife, pregnant with their first child, into the last lifeboat and kissed her goodbye. It was likely that some or many of the men who died didn't wish to perform acts of gallantry. Many knew that they would encounter persistent shaming back home if they managed to get a lifeboat seat. Others, by nature and by training, were dedicated to living out their duty, even unto death. The passenger survival rate told the story. Of first-class passengers, 97% of the women, as compared to 33% of the men, survived. Of second-class passengers, 86% of the women and only 8% of the men survived. In steerage, the women did less well than other women, with 46% surviving, but still had a significantly higher chance of being rescued than the wealthiest and most privileged man. Men in steerage, like all other men, had a low survival rate at 16%. Perhaps notably, children overall fared somewhat less well than the women. Though 100% of children in second class survived, only 83% in first class and 34% in third class escaped death. For many of those who reflected after the event on the meaning of the Titanic, the age-old verities of self-sacrificing men and protected women seemed obvious. And this element of the Titanic saga has been ably, if somewhat skeptically, reported by Stephen Beale in his 1996 book titled Down with the Old Canoe, A Cultural History of the Titanic Disaster. In this video, I rely heavily on Beale's book, which I recommend as a fascinating source of information, though I regret that Beale seemed to find it necessary to be rather sneering in reporting on what he calls Titanic myths, including the myth of male chivalry. But it wasn't a myth. As Beale notes, many commentators emphasized the gendered division between those who sacrificed and those who were saved. An editorial for Collier's magazine argued that the behavior of the men on board showed that there was more to patriarchy than simply the rule of the stronger over the weaker. There was also the duty of care shown by the men. Quote, power and trust carry with them in emergencies the privilege to be self-forgetful and to die, wrote the Collier's editorialist. At a time when agitation by feminists for the right to vote was widespread in both England and the United States, many who wrote editorials or wrote letters to the newspaper hoped that the angry activists were paying attention and drawing the correct lesson, which was that a benevolent patriarchy protected women and secured their interests far more effectively than the mere right to vote ever could. The editors of the Baltimore Sun emphasized that, quote, the action of the men on the Titanic was not exceptional, but it must be recognized as an act of supreme heroism and as showing that women can appeal to a higher law than that of the ballot for justice, consideration, and protection, end quote. Other commentators asked the question that has never, to my knowledge, been honestly and satisfactorily answered by any feminist. If equality means equal suffering and death at times of crisis, which it must do if it is really equality, then do women want equality? And if women don't want that kind of equality, why do they repeatedly pretend they do? One letter writer, calling himself Mere Man, asked the question, would the suffragette have stood on that deck for women's rights or for women's privileges? Reverend W.S. Plumer Bryan drew a similar conclusion for feminists. Quote, the women who are demanding political rights may well take care lest they lose what is infinitely dearer, he warned. If men and women are to be rivals, can she expect such chivalrous protection as the women of the Titanic received? End quote. Members of the National Association opposed to women's suffrage pointed out that the women who went into the lifeboats, whatever they might say about equality in other contexts, were not feminists. Quote, when the final crash came, men and women alike were unanimous in making the sex distinction. It was not a question of voters first, but the cry all over the ship was women first. In acquiescing to that cry, the women admitted that they were not fitted for men's tasks. They did not think of the boasted equality in all things. This is not an implication that women are inferior. It just shows an inequality or a difference, end quote. Immediately after the disaster, many women wanted to express their gratitude for male protectiveness. Within a few weeks, the Women's Titanic Memorial Fund was organized by American women to build a monument in tribute to manhood. It raised $500,000 through donations, including from Titanic survivor Mrs. Archibald Forbes, who had played bridge with John Jacob Astor just hours before the sinking. Featuring a statue sculpted by John Horgan, the Women's Titanic Memorial was unveiled in 1931 and now stands in Washington, D.C. The monument is dedicated, quote, to the brave men who perished in the wreck of the Titanic, April 15, 1912. They gave their lives that women and children might be saved. An editorial described it as a monument, quote, from the weaker to the stronger, from the grateful to the gallant, from the saved to the saver of life, end quote. Not surprisingly, however, not all women at the time expressed gratitude towards men, and many refused even to modify their anti-male denunciations in the days and weeks following the wreck. One letter writer didn't like the fact that the Women's Titanic Memorial Fund was dedicated to male heroes, asking, quote, "Why not, instead of having the memorial solely for the heroes of the wreck, have it also for the heroines?" She had missed the point that it was only men who had died and died in such numbers because of their sex and for women and children. Another woman simply refused to accept that men had behaved heroically, asserting in a letter to the Baltimore Sun that much, if not all, of the alleged heroism, quote, was due to the belief in the unsinkable qualities of the ship or to the part pistols played in converting cowards into brave men. It wasn't enough for her that the men were dead. It was necessary to deflate the praise being offered, emphasizing either male ignorance or compulsion. Other feminist commentators simply glossed over the significance of male sacrifice, twisting the meaning of the disaster to make it about the need to empower women politically. Alice Stone Blackwell, editor of the North American Woman Suffrage Association's publication titled The Woman's Journal, acknowledged that some men had acted chivalrously, but called for a, quote, new chivalry, one that could only come about when women had political power, because true chivalry, according to Blackwell, was a characteristic of women rather than men. She made her claim by focusing solely on the suffering of women and girls generally. Quote, "The chivalry shown to a few hundred women on the Titanic," she wrote, "does not alter the fact that in New York City, 150,000 people, largely women and children, have to sleep in dark rooms with no windows, that the lives and health of thousands of women and children are sacrificed continually through their exploitation in mills, workshops, and factories. These things are facts," end quote. As feminists nearly always do, she quickly diverted attention from an actual instance of extraordinary male selflessness to an alleged instance of male indifference, focusing solely on the suffering of poor women and girls, ignoring or denying that of boys and men who certainly suffered at least equally as a result of poverty, industrial exploitation, and unhealthy living and working conditions. Her claim that women were more chivalrous than men was flat out contradicted in her failure to consider any of the ways that men and boys also deserved compassion. Other commentators used a different but equally standard feminist tactic in blaming men for the Titanic accident, claiming that it was men's fault the ship had sunk, and alleging that once women had more power, accidents at sea would rapidly diminish or cease altogether. Feminist Agnes Ryan wrote for the aforementioned Woman's Journal that, quote, "wholesale life-taking disasters must almost be expected, so long as, quote, "the laws and the enforcement of the laws are entirely in men's hands," end quote. She was convinced that, quote, "the Votes for Woman movement seeks to bring humaneness and the valuation of human life into the commerce and transportation and business of the world and establish things on a new basis, a basis in which the unit of measurement is life, nothing but life," end quote. Women cared about life, allegedly, while men cared only about money, according to Agnes Ryan. The previously mentioned Alice Blackwell sounded the same fantastical note, asserting that, quote, "there was no need that a single life should have been lost upon the Titanic," and claiming that, quote, "there will be far fewer lost by preventable accidents either on land or sea when the mothers of men have the right to vote," end quote. Exploiting this absurd argument based on collective blame, some feminists thought sacrificing themselves for the women was the least the men could have done. After all, wrote one letter writer, the women on the boat were not responsible for the disaster, the implication being that it was only right that men should reap the rewards of male irresponsibility. The only well-known feminist who made an equality argument about the disaster was the anarchist activist Emma Goldman, who was lecturing in Denver, Colorado when news of the Titanic first broke. Goldman was primarily a political agitator who advocated for birth control and free love so that women could join their brother workers in dedicating themselves to revolution. She castigated the women who had accepted men's offer of sacrifice because by doing so, they showed themselves the physical and moral children that they still were. They should have died like their men, she declared. In fact, it is known that one woman, Ida Strauss, did refuse to leave her husband, millionaire businessman and co-owner of Macy's department store, Isidor Strauss. The couple perished together in their cabin. It's not known if any other women made the decision to stay back with men they loved. Many, faced with the terror of the icy blackness, probably kissed their husbands goodbye and hoped that it might not be for the last time. There's something uncomfortable in moralizing about the Titanic or about any instance of male sacrifice. Undoubtedly, most of us would wish to live in a society where no one is forced to make such choices or to prove their worthiness by dying, as only men ever must do. But the awkward question does arise. Do feminists advocate equality in self-sacrifice? Would the feminists refuse the lifeboats in a similar situation? And having accepted the metaphorical lifeboat that modern society offers women, how much longer can feminists continue in their refusal of gratitude and their insistence on male privilege? Too many modern feminists sound exactly like those who thought that dying to save women was the very least the men could do.